Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison is away this week. Delighted to have you joining us for day 2 on our week on forgiveness. Yesterday, we had an opportunity to be joined by Fred Luskin from Stanford University and my colleague and co-producer of this week's show, Eileen Barker, where we spent some time talking about forgiveness. And one of the questions was, with all of the benefit that's possible as a result of forgiveness, why is it so hard for us as human beings to forgive? And so today we're delighted to have a couple of researchers with us who can hopefully help us understand the answer to that question. And one of the realities is that as a colleague, Chip Connolly of the Modern Elder Academy wrote in a blog post this morning, heaven is a new pair of glasses. Literally, forgiveness is like putting on a new pair of glasses. And it benefits us, and it certainly benefits others who we're in relationship with. And so the question is, why is it seemingly so hard to just put on a new pair of glasses? What gets in the way? And we look at throughout human history, on the positive side, in Rwanda, 30 years ago, 800,000 people were killed in 100 days. And 30 years later, the country just celebrated the anniversary of that genocide. And they have been held up as a stellar example of what's possible. We've seen the same thing happen in South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation. There are lots of examples, lots of stories throughout human history where it's possible to forgive. We can all look in our own personal lives where we've had moments where we've been able to forgive. And we've seen the benefits of that forgiveness. And we all know it, that to not forgive is like self-administered poison. Why do we keep drinking the poison when it's so easy to just put it down and to forgive? So we'll be exploring that topic today. I'd like to invite my good friend and colleague, Eileen Barker, to join.
Hello there.
Hi, Eileen.
Hi, Tom. I like the way you framed that today. And I would say right behind that question, the question I always ask is, and then what helps us? Because we know that even though it is so hard, and even though many are reluctant, we are able to at times. And it does seem that sometimes under the hardest circumstances or the most horrific even is what does propel people to forgiveness and healing. And so if we don't want to have to wait for those moments, that's people call it the 2x4 method, where we really hit over the head and have no choice in some way. Of course, we always have a choice, but if we don't want that, how can we embrace it in a more positive way? And we do also see all around us evidence of that embracing of change and higher consciousness and so forth. So how can we, take advantage of our wiring and our biology so that we can really move forward as a species? Just some small questions.
Yes. Well, I'm delighted to be getting into those and exploring those questions today, and would like to invite our two panelists, Laurent Tussaud and Marco Iacoboni, to join us. Welcome, Lauren. Welcome, Marco.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to start if each of you could just share a little bit about the work that you are doing and the research that you have been able to help us understand this question or series of questions that we're exploring today. Marco, would you like to go first?
Sure. I'm a neurologist and neuroscientist from Italy originally. I've been living in LA for more than 30 years now. I'm a professor at UCLA in the Brain Mapping Center. And I've done research on, I guess one of the reasons I'm in these panels because I've done some decent research on how the brain implements empathy in other people. And then I've done other things in which I try to invite people to overcome differences One thing we're doing now at UCLA, we just started a whole center. I'm one of the leaders in the center called the Center for Neuroscience and Society, in which we partner, UCLA partners with Charles Drew University, which is in South LA. And if you know LA, you go from the west side to South LA, they really look like two completely different cities. There's a lot of differences in terms of the socioeconomic status and many other things between those two parts of the city. And what we're trying to do is really to partner with the community, underserved communities, and have questions that drive neuroscience research that are relevant to them. So that's one way we should try to overcome differences. And I'm guessing that's one of the reasons I'm here. I studied these cells in the brain called mirror neurons, which seem to be very important for empathy. And empathy is something that's really important for forgiveness, because you put yourself in some other people's shoes and then you try to see things from their point of view. Sometimes it's very difficult, I understand. But at the end of the day, one thing I always say is that even though empathy and forgiveness seem to be something that is fundamentally altruistic, it's also eminently selfish, in the sense that if you are able to do that, it's good for you. It's very good for you.
Well, thank you for those opening comments and for your research and work, and delighted to have you with us today. Lauren?
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is a real delight and an honor to be part of this conversation. For probably close to 25 years now, I guess, as I think about the time that has elapsed, I've been interested in two things. One is, why is forgiveness good for us? How is it good for us? Just generally speaking, what are the benefits? We've identified a lot of those things, and I imagine that we'll probably get into some of that later, so I won't go on just too much at the moment. But that's been one, real main interest and thrust of my work for a long time, is to just try to understand best why this thing is, this thing that we call forgiveness, why does it seem to help us in ways that, seem kind of ironic, frankly. Often I think people, think of forgiveness as kind of a thing that you sometimes do when you don't know what else to do, and it just really hurts a lot. So that's one aim, but as we have continued to identify more and more benefits of forgiveness, the next question that follows from that is, well, if it seems to be something that does good things for me, then how do I do it? How do I do it better? And I think that's kind of, parallels lots of things that we find in the world when people find out that losing weight is good for you. They want to know what's the best way to do it? What's the best diet? When you find out that exercise is good and has benefits, people want to know what's the perfect kind of exercise regimen, and how often and how much, and how intense, and all these questions. In those realms, sometimes you wonder about, like, how little of this can I do and get away with it and still be well. And that might be the same question with forgiveness, but there's lots of questions about, like, how do I do this better? And we're working on 3 different methods. One for kids, one that is focused exclusively on self-forgiveness, and then another that is aimed at, kind of forgiveness in the larger social ramifications for peacemaking and just a more peaceful world. So, thanks for having me. This is wonderful. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, speaking of peace, and just take a quick moment to wish former U.S. President Jimmy Carter a happy 100th birthday. He's certainly been an exemplar of what is possible, and has had an extraordinary life. But especially since leaving the White House and the presidency, he has been a remarkable leader. And just want to take a moment to wish him a happy 100th birthday, and delighted that he's done so much for the world. So maybe picking up on the comments of, from both of you, the big question is, if we can benefit, and we do benefit from forgiveness, and we're hardwired for collaboration and cooperation, why is it so hard for us to forgive? Is there something in our skull brain that prevents us from forgiveness? What's going on?
Yeah, I think, if I could take a stab at that one, there's a good deal of research on forgiveness and the neural substrates of forgiveness and what seems to be happening in our brains when we forgive. And, to kind of the best of my ability to summarize this, and I'm sure Marco can help me fill in some of the gaps here, but one of the things that I understand about forgiveness is that it's a very emotional experience. When you're hurt, typically things that require forgiveness are things that are, pretty meaningful and fairly deep hurts. In other words, when someone bumps into you in the line at the theater and you're watching a movie, you're going to see this, like no big deal, whatever. But when you encounter these situations that are really meaningful, deep hurts, it elicits a lot of emotions, and there's kind of emotional sides of our.
Oh dear. Oh, I'm not really we lost you for a minute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Am I back?
You're back. You're just saying there are emotional sides.
Yeah.
Of our, I think, whatever.
Just mentioned the bumping into a movie theater. That was
yeah.
So
when you get to a deeper level of hurt, you have certain emotional aspects of your brain that are engaged, and certainly it feels like to me, and I think it probably feels like to many of you, the requirement that's being asked of you in forgiving is to inhibit those emotions. And there's a certain segment of the nervous system that is really meant to kind of put the brakes on that emotional reaction. However, that braking mechanism is not an easy one to engage. It requires much of our frontal lobes, specific areas in the frontal lobe that are involved in kind of planning and decision making and evaluation of things. Very important things that, I oftentimes kind of just summarize it simply as saying, your frontal lobe is kind of like a brake for life, right? That you just kind of have to sometimes put the brakes on things that you want to say or do. And that's not the part of the brain that's as easily controlled sometimes. The emotional side seems like it leaks out a lot easier. So I think one of the things that we run into is just, the nature of our central nervous system, the nature of our fight or flight response is that these things are evolved and adaptive and immediate. And the things required for forgiveness are a little bit slower to take effect, and they require cognitive exertion. And the neural substrates that support this are much more sophisticated and require a lot of intercommunication. And so it's a little bit slower, a little more intentional process. So not to mention, and I hope that Marco, you fill in some pieces here, a big third piece of the forgiveness equation is this ability to see the other side of the equation and try to understand why the person that hurt you did what they did. And that's just not an easy thing to do. So when you think about forgiveness in the brain, it's kind of like there's a restraint braking mechanism. There's an empathy component that's meant to kind of facilitate your understanding of why someone might have just done this. And then there's a third piece that's really called like social evaluation, right? Is this really worth it? And those are hard things to evaluate, especially in the context of a really deeply emotional, upsetting hurt.
Okay, so you said a lot of good things and important things. Yes, I think that, when you talk about, for instance, the part of the brain, frontal lobe, that implements what we call cognitive control, the ability to control ourselves and not to be driven only by very raw emotions. Those regions are also the ones that are important for what's called perspective taking. That is this capacity to have empathy in a cognitive way. There are two main ways of empathizing with others. One is emotional, I see Tom falling from the bike and I really feel his pain right away. And that's what's called the emotional sort of empathy. But then there's the more cognitive one, in which I'm trying to put myself in his shoes, that is having this panel with these two guys that just rambling about stuff. And so the idea is that you can actually use the same mechanisms that are, on one way, you can use them to control raw emotions. In the other way, you can actually flexibly deploy your neural resources to get into the minds of others, try to see things from the point of view of other people. So I don't think it's necessarily that difficult to forgive. A lot of it has to do with the individual differences. Individual differences are really important in psychology and neuroscience, in society, I would say too. A lot of our individual differences are also not just driven by neurobiology, by also by our cultural upbringing, by the kind of nurturing environment we grew up with or not. So these are all variables that are very difficult to quantify in a simple way. But again, one thing I would try to emphasize is that you may have, the tendency not to forgive, but at the end of the day, it's really not going to be good for you. Trying to forgive other people is really something that if you overcome these very negative emotions, the payoff is going to be for you too. You're going to feel a much happier human being, much more fulfilled human being if you're able to actually overcome these differences, especially the negative emotions that often sweep us away. I mean, I get it. And people, when you're driven by those emotions, it's very difficult to summon your control. But at the end of the day, again, it's about, let's go back to your example of exercising. A lot of it has to do with exercising. You can exercise your body, you can also exercise your mind. You can do that in many different ways. You can do it by thinking, you can do it by reading. I invite people to read the good old Stoics, because those guys are always considered people that are very stiff, but actually a lot of them were very empathic, and they were really good at giving you advice on how to discipline your own mind. And doing these things, again, it's really something that in the long term is going to be a good payoff for you. You're going to be a much happier person. You're going to be, your interior life will be much richer, because you're going to see things in many different ways, from many different perspectives. And that's going to help you being a much happier human being overall.
Yeah, one of the things we talked about yesterday is, in any given human interaction, there's the facts of what happened, and then there's the story that we create around those facts that can generate the sense of injury, the sense of harm, the opportunity to show up in a way that we do. And oftentimes it's, I'm a victim, the story that I create around the facts without all of the information about the motivation and intention of the other party. We create this story that results in, I'm the victim, and why should I have to forgive? And I'm wondering, just in terms of how much of that, to your comments, Marco, how much of that's cultural, how much of that's actually the wiring in our brain? Is it the amygdala, fight and flight, freeze response, or is it just to your comment, Loren, is it just that the prefrontal cortex is operating at a slower rate than the other parts of the brain, or is it something else?
I had the same question, Tom, about the role of the story. I'm glad you brought that up. I just want to add one other layer of it, which is that I think it's not just you were just talking about the powerful emotions. Both of you spoke about that. I think sometimes what happens is something happens and we have a strong emotional reaction, a difficult one, painful one perhaps, and then we tell the story. Then oh, that hurts. Now I'm looking for who's responsible for this, who can I blame, how am I the victim? But it's sort of born out of the emotions. And I wonder sometimes, is that, sort of a protective mechanism that we then create a story where we're the victim, someone else is to blame and so forth, is that it seems to to also flow from the emotions. Yeah.
Well, I would say that I have to reveal my biases. I'm a motor guy. At the end of the day, I started doing my research in the brain because I wanted to understand how the brain implements actions. And I think that when we get into these narratives in which we are really the victims, then we're really doing something bad to our own agency. You really want to assert your own agency and completely change this role playing in which you become the victim. Maybe
Yes.
you are in a situation in which you are victimized, but you can actually completely flip that. And one way of doing that is also forgiveness. That shows really the ability to be an agent of your own life. And agency is such an important component. But not too many people talk about agency when we talk about psychology and neuroscience, but agency is so big in your life. Remember, you're always an independent agent, and affirming your agency is very important. Also remember, you're a social agent. You belong to a society. So you want to be a social agent that, consider other people and act accordingly. But agency is very important. So don't feel victimized just because something did something wrong to you.
Right.
It happened, but you can actually completely flip that story.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's the exact dynamic. I mean, that's one of the big benefits of forgiveness is that if we have gone towards a victimization, we can reclaim our power, our agency, through the forgiveness process or whatever process is used. And I think what you're suggesting, Marco, which is great, is we don't need to go there in the first place. Just keep your agency. And of course, that's the ultimate goal. Yeah, and I
Even
know,
the capacity not to be totally offended or in pain because of some wrongdoing of other people. That's also affirming agency.
Yeah, and I would just add to this. Often when I think about like the neuroscience of just about anything, but particularly in this context, um, sometimes people see like brain imaging scans and they think like, oh, I'm kind of I'm just at the mercy of how my brain is functioning in this moment, and that kind of explains why I do what I do, but it totally removes from that equation the fact that what we choose to do and how we choose to react is what kind of directs what aspects of the brain we're using. And so if I go back to my kind of like three-part model of the neuroscience of forgiveness, if you're telling a victim story because you choose to, and you've just let go of all of your aims and goals and agency in life, I mean, if you just kind of feel like that's the only thing you can do, then you're likely to engage that sort of emotional side of the brain. You're making it very difficult to control those emotions, and they're going to kind of spin out of control through rumination and other things, ultimately having some pretty negative impact on your mental and physical health. And so if you choose to tell a different story, one that engages more the empathy component of the brain, or if it engages more the components of the brain that are involved in this kind of social valuation, the understanding of, hey, these things are important to me. One thing we know about forgiveness is that it changes a little bit when we go to like collectivistic societies, because collectivistic societies have such a great importance placed on relationships and on family and on community and on the collective. And so if you engage those things, or if your brain exists in that culture, then you have kind of a natural, you might say a natural leg up in terms of defaulting to thinking more about processing more of the kind of social relational value of this situation. This person hurt me, but I would like to still be able to maintain the integrity of my community or my family, and I don't want to let this grow beyond something else. And so I often think that the neuroscience of forgiveness can be viewed from one direction as the brain is kind of directing these different responses in forgiveness, but it's also the case that the experience of forgiveness is directing and influencing the nature of the brain. And I think, Marco, I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, but I was taught that brain cells that fire together, that is, brain cells that work together, kind of they brain cells that fire together wire together, meaning they create stronger connections to each other. And so the circuits that you really want to strengthen and reinforce are those that place high value on social relationships and maintaining good connections and understanding how other people are having to deal with the same stresses as you are in life and sometimes make mistakes and hurt us, and trying to maybe even to the extent possible at least minimize that initial negative emotional tone that is also so often a component. I don't think we're going to get rid of that. I don't think we're going to get by it. And it's probably not a good idea that we do, that there is adaptive protective value to negative emotions. And if somebody has hurt you really significantly, if they physically abused you or sexually abused you, you need to be alerted to the fact that this is not a good place to be and a good relationship to be in. You need to get out of that thing. But, it doesn't mean that you have to live with those emotions only for the rest of your life. You can consider other aspects of your experience and hopefully, engage other parts of your brain to bring you some sort of peace and healing. So.
Yeah, so you said a couple of things that are really important that they go back again to your notion, to your example initially of exercising your body. The fact that, people are fascinated by the brain, but the brain is very plastic. And actually, when I went to med school, which was a long time ago, unfortunately for me, the idea was that we hit like 25 years old and then we just start losing neurons. That wasn't true at all. I mean, that's a bioscience. We actually get better at figuring things out. And now we know you can have neurogenesis much later in life. And as you said, synaptic plasticity, which when neurons fire together, they wire together, are going to reshape the way your brain is and works. So you can always do that. Again, so put these two things together, exercising your body, and the fact that your brain is plastic. You can use, again, your agency and your mental discipline to retrain your brain to get out of those negative emotions and these things that make you feel you're a victim, you were wronged, and you have all these really negativity. Because at the end of the day, this is the only life you have. And you can try to assert your agency again, your positive emotions, to make it a better life. And when you do that, it's contagious. We know that emotions are contagious. So the happier you are, the happier the people around you will be. So you generated really a positive cascading effect that snowballs into something that's good for society. I know it's much easier to say than to do it, but a lot of it depends on really mental discipline.
I'm picking up on one of the comments in the chat. There was a question posed about intergenerational trauma and PTSD. And I'm wondering if you could, if each of you could speak to that as well.
Okay, I want to say one thing about it. I read that thing. When we started this whole Center for Neuroscience and Society, we went to South LA and we met with community organizers. And first of all, I have to say, even though I've been living in LA for 30 years and never been in South LA, and I was pretty shocked when I saw it the first time. But then one thing that came out was we did these things called human-centered design, in which we get together and we discuss certain things, and then we come up with things that are very important for the community. And one thing that came out, one of the strongest things was the intergenerational trauma. And to me, it was actually, I was striking because I thought, okay, we don't really study that much in neuroscience, but we have the possibility of doing it. So that's one of the main missions of the center, is to really study the neuroscience of intergenerational trauma. And I think that's really important. And again, it's a cultural thing, but it's also a biological thing. To me, it's amazing how you can actually overcome these differences, because it's very easy to live in West Side LA, in your beautiful campus, do your research, and you live in a kind of a bubble. But then you have to realize that to be a good citizen, you also have to go to the parts of the city that are not as nice and lucky as you are. And you get also these gifts, because to me, understanding that intergenerational trauma, it's not only a big thing for those people, but also is something that I can actually try and study and help people. It's fairly late in my career, it's actually, I consider it a gift because it opens up a lot of new avenues for research too. That's what I have to say about it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think this is great. It's a superb question. I don't know who asked it. Maybe a week or two ago, I gave a different talk on intergenerational ACEs, essentially trauma, and the role of forgiveness and self-forgiveness. And the thing that I was just sort of flat amazed by is that we asked a group of people to rate their the number of traumas that they had in their childhood. And these are parents that are probably average age of about 35, 40 years old. We said, rate your ACEs for us. And then we asked them to rate the ACEs of their children. And these are kids that were on average probably about 4 to 5 years old. And certainly the 4 to 5 year old kids haven't had a whole lot of lifetime to experience ACEs, right? So there's a little bit of a limitation in terms of the age of our kids was quite young. But one thing that was very clear is that parents that reported having more ACEs themselves also reported their children having more ACEs in their lives. So there was a good positive correlation between parents and children's ACEs that we expected, because intergenerational trauma research shows us that, you know, these are things that happen, right? That we kind of tend to pass this along to the next generation. What we had not ever seen before was that parents that were more forgiving of other people and parents who were more forgiving of themselves, both forgiving others and forgiving themselves, the relationship between parents' ACEs and children's ACEs was reduced statistically to 0 for the most forgiving parents. So parents that were able to forgive other people and forgive themselves in our data did not pass those same ACEs along to their children. People that were even moderately forgiving did, but at a slower, lower rate. And those who were the least forgiving had the strongest connection between their ACEs and their kids' ACEs. Suggesting to me anyway that there's a lot more for us to learn about the mechanisms here involved in essentially kind of, I call it short-circuiting the generational transfer of ACEs from parents to children. If you can, you know, embolden the parents to at very least empower parents to engage in forgiving others and forgiving themselves. And I think if you look at, especially if you look at the kind of classic 10-item ACEs measures that are used, most of the traumas that we're talking about are things that are the result of other people doing really bad things.
Can you give us some examples of the ACEs just to bring this home?
Yeah, it would be things like physical or mental abuse, sexual abuse, either experiencing it directly or witnessing it in the home. These are also things like someone using alcohol or drugs in the home, and either, you know, being exposed to that directly or being part of it. And things like divorce is on the list, having divorced parents. And then I think about the last category is incarceration, or having, you know, significant troubles with the law, you know, more than like a traffic ticket sort of thing. So, yeah, things that kind of by their nature have kind of a interpersonal aspect to them, especially in families.
That's very powerful.
One of the questions posed was your sample just in the U.S., and would it be applicable if it was just the U.S.? Do you think it would be applicable to cultures outside the U.S.?
Yeah, well, as I said, it's the first time we've ever encountered this, and the only reason we did is because we were doing research in other areas, and folks were kind enough to allow me to sneak in some measures of forgiveness. Turns out it's probably the thing that we least expected and were most surprised by. But it was an entirely unfunded study, and we didn't have resources to go for broad samples, and certainly not an international sample. Although that's our plan, is to find ways to do this. It's a very homogeneous Upper Midwestern sample, so yeah, I have no reason to believe that it would be any different anywhere else. ACEs are ACEs wherever you are. Nevertheless, I mean, there are cultural and racial and contextual variables that are important to take into account, and we obviously need to do that. So I don't want to minimize that. It's an important thing for us to do.
Excuse me, this might be a time to just mention, when I spoke to Loren initially about this, one of the conclusions we quickly reached was that this whole area is underfunded in terms of research, and it's so important to us as a society and individuals, and yet so little research is really being done. Obviously, Marco, you're in a very good position in your where you're working, but just on the whole. So I just want to make a plug for that. If anybody should see this broadcast and be moved by this is really an important area that, you're saying an unfunded study, but look at how powerful those results are. And then I just wanted to pivot to something you said earlier, because you mentioned how different forgiveness is in collectivistic cultures. Here in the US, we have a very litigious culture. I mean, very in our lifetime. I mean, I'm sure some of us can remember when that first began. I think maybe around the 70s, 80s, where so people just started suing for every little infraction. And as a mediator, that's something that, I think we're still dealing with that, obviously. But I'm curious, what can we learn from those collectivistic cultures? Can we learn from that? What do they do differently? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I'll let, I don't want to dominate the conversation. I'll let Marco respond. I have other things I can say, certainly.
All
Well,
right.
to go back to the previous point, their research is unfunded because it's difficult to fund, because it's also difficult to tackle experimentally. It's very complicated, requires a lot of funding. What we tend to fund are things that are more tangible, more achievable, things which we think are promising, that we can achieve a result, and looking into intergenerational interactions and the effects of what the parents do on the children. You can do studies on those, but it's complicated, it's tough, and that's why it's difficult to fund. And to really do it on a large scale, to see, for instance, the difference between what happens in an affluent neighborhood versus a not so affluent neighborhood, those are even more large scale studies. They're very difficult to organize, to coordinate. That's one of the main reasons. It's not it's unfunded because the questions asked are much tougher to address experimentally. That's one of the main reasons. But I think we got to a point in which we should actually try to tackle questions. And if I think about the amendment on weapons that we could divert to research, would really benefit our society tremendously. And we don't do it. We just, we build more and more nuclear weapons or missiles and, and airplanes, that kind of stuff. And that's really it's a whole other, discussion about how we use what we have in our society in terms of what is it that we want to fund and help. So that's one thing I want to say. What was the question again? I forgot your question.
Well, earlier, Loren had mentioned about how different collectivistic cultures are when it comes to forgiveness. I was asking about that and what we might learn from them.
We can learn a lot, and actually, I like collectivistic societies more than individualistic ones. Even though I moved from Italy, which is kind of in the middle. It's not like Asian societies, but it's way more collectivistic than the U.S. But there are some things I really like about the U.S., especially West Coast, the creativity, also the sense of individual freedom. That's really something very good that often you don't feel. I grew up in Rome, and Rome is great, the people are great, but also you have this sense that, everything is a little more controlled. Your parents, your relatives, your friends, the ties are important, but in a way they're also more, they constrain you a little bit more. So those are really dramatic cultural differences. And you can certainly learn from collectivist societies, but after you learn, how do you implement it in a society that is so individualistic like the US? It's not that easy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But specifically around conflict, Marco, and forgiveness, is it because the social ties are stronger?
Yeah, well, maybe because of that, maybe because, again, having these tight relations, people realize that, to go back to something we were discussing before the show, that we are all human beings. And often I feel that, especially in the public discourse in the US, people forget that we have this common humanity. And they just see themselves as liberals versus conservatives. And that's something that you should try to really overcome. Again, it's not easy because you also have to have the other part to be able to do that. But in a way, doing that is going to help everybody. It's going to help not only you when you actually try to have reconciliation at some level, but also down the line, the future generations, because you actually instill this sense, well, we can overcome differences. We can focus not so much on what divides us, but what actually we have in common. We all have to eat. We all have to love. We all have to protect each other and our friends and family. Now, let's focus on what actually is common. Collectivism, it's about that. What is it that we have in common? Individualism is about, I'm Marco, you are Lauren, and, we share some things, but maybe not that many. So a lot of it has to do with how you really refocus your attention. But again, most of these things, we go back to the initial thing that Lauren said about training and exercising. A lot of it is built on habits. And changing habits is not that easy. But again, if you want to do it, if you want to affirm your agency, you can do it. Except that, at societal level, it becomes more complicated because you need to have more cooperation from other people. But again, let's not forget that a lot of the things we do are also contagious. We can actually teach by example. The emotions we feel, we can spread those emotions, especially the positive ones, although the negative ones also get spread very easily. But we can try and change that kind of conversation and become more collectivistic and more and less individualistic. Again, it's a nice, I like to balance the two things. I mean, I also like individual freedom, but in a good way, not in a way that is negative for me and for others.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think, to reemphasize Marco's excellent point there about, kind of practicing and emphasizing the things that we want to get better at and allowing it to spread. If you look at some of these collectivistic cultures that have really done amazing things with forgiveness, places that pop to mind are places like South Africa, Rwanda, a place where I started some forgiveness work in Sierra Leone, in the western part of Africa. The collectivistic culture in these places is one that has done something, I think, that is entirely possible in an individualistic culture, and that is they have championed forgiveness. They have made it something they really, really want as a society. And I think Marco's right. I mean, when we consider things like looking at our national budget and how we decide to spend our money as a society, it's pretty clear we don't value forgiveness very highly. We really value the ability to punch back. And so to some extent, I guess, somebody may have to, be responsible for that role. But if you look at Sierra Leone, they have a process called Famboul Talk, and it's translated into family talk. And these are community kind of cultural organized meetings, often around kind of ritual and things that happen in the community and in the tribal nature of the natural groupings that people have, that facilitate from the kind of social community and cultural experience the value, the importance of forgiveness. In Rwanda, you see similar things and similar championing of the call to forgiveness. Certainly in South Africa, you can point to several different things there that kind of elevated the level of forgiveness. And so the thing I would say is that I don't think there's anything particularly important about being collectivistic or individualistic as it comes to forgiveness. It's just that the collectivistic culture seems to kind of value and promote more innately the importance of forgiveness, and hence it becomes kind of a natural part of the experience. Here where I'm at Luther College, in the upper Midwest, we have a lot of individuals from the Amish faith, the Amish tradition, and they are a subculture under their own. But one thing that we find when we talk and study these groups, talk with these people and study these groups, is that they have forgiveness woven into multiple aspects of their culture in ways that just simply do not exist in typical American culture. I would say here's one interesting thing, however, if you look at things like smoking, you look at seatbelt use, if you look at things like the kind of diet that we kind of generally think of as being normal or healthy, I don't know if there's a country or a place on earth that's better at promoting and marketing than the US. I mean, when we have an idea that we want to convince the US and the world population about, we are kings at doing that. And the only reason why we don't do that with forgiveness is I think it's a value structure thing. So, I mean, if you look back 20, 30, 40 years, smoking was considered to be healthy. Today, everyone knows that smoking is not healthy. If they don't know it, there's a very small segment of people. The same thing for seatbelt use, the same thing for, diet and exercise and all those things. I mean, once we know something is the right message, we are superb at getting that message out. And I think that's just the nature of forgiveness, is that we need to elevate it so that it can be promoted. Public health campaigns, public service messages, we know how to do this. We just don't.
And, this is exciting to me to hear you say all of that, Loren. It's really important. One of the things South Africa had in particular, I think that probably was the most important factor, is leadership.
Yeah.
When you had
Yeah.
Mandela and Tutu come together, and in such a powerful way, they led the way. They set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It came from the top, and then maybe was supported by other factors in the culture. But fundamentally, that's the other thing we need, is as a leader to really embrace this and to champion it, as you say, champion of forgiveness, and then all of the PSA and all of the things that support that. But I think that's that's why I think research is important too, because the more, I mean, we know. I don't need any science to tell me how important forgiveness is or what the benefits are. I've experienced it. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I know the way that this society works is if you can prove it. People want to see proof, concrete. It makes a difference. It's really helpful. It'll save us money, all the things. It's, and we really do have to look at our investment in war and fighting and defense. What do you call it? The punch back. I like that.
Okay. Yeah.
Punching. What's our investment in that? Not saying it should be zero, of course, we need that, but we need this much. And then our investment in health, well-being, and peace. I think that at that point where we need to choose as a society.
And I would also just add that in places like Sierra Leone, leadership was really not good and did not favor forgiveness. There were a few people sprinkled in leadership at the close of their civil war, but I think that in the absence of really strong leadership, just to make sure that nobody feels like they're off the hook here, it comes from down below. It's a grassroots effort, right? If it can't come from leadership, it has to start somewhere. And in places like Sierra Leone, I think it really did start in these Famboul talk communities.
So I wanted to say something about what I like to look at the outcome measures, because those are really hard facts. And if you look at outcome, and of course, if you look at life expectancy, advanced societies have greater life expectancy than less advanced societies. That's a no-brainer. But within advanced societies, if you look at collectivistic societies versus individualistic societies, the ones that have higher life expectancy are the collectivistic ones. So being collectivist is actually good for you too, again. So just think about this really hard outcome measure and try to change the whole dialogue. I know it's not easy, especially, in a big society like the US, which are also these large differences between the two coasts and the middle of the country. So these are really big cultural differences. But again, if you can spread the word, look, the more collectivist is the society, the longer they live. Don't you want to live longer?
And Marco, I'm really glad you brought that up, because we did a study now a few years back. Well, it's been a while now, but we were able to document very clearly that the most forgiving people end up living a little bit longer. Their odds of death. Now, this is an older sample, 60 years of age and older, but people that are more forgiving had about somewhere between 25 and 50% greater.
The Wi-Fi is not forgiving.
Yeah.
Let's see if he comes back. I don't. Okay.
We lost you, Lauren.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it keeps saying my internet connection is unstable, even though I'm on a wired. I was just saying that you have a 25 to 50% increased probability that you will still be living 3 years later if you're more forgiving, as compared to people who are less forgiving. And this is in an older sample, 60 plus years of age. I think the average age was probably about 70.
Let's just continue. If you're not forgiving, you have resentment. Resentment is negative emotion. So a negative emotion is going to reduce your life. I mean, just it's not that complicated.
Right. Yeah, we've known for a long time negative emotions are bad for our longevity. That's for sure.
You wrote a book about this, Lauren. Yes, about the health and past and so forth. Yeah. Well, that should be motivating in itself. Yeah.
I wanted to just pick up on that. I've certainly in my life, I've encountered people who had extraordinary situations where they should be harboring anger, they should be harboring resentment, and yet the ability for them to forgive, it's almost like they're glowing. It's almost like they're a beacon of what's possible. And so we have those examples. I mean, throughout human history, we have examples where people have been able to forgive the most horrendous acts, and they've spoken about it. And yet, to the prior conversation, we're not using metrics of quality of life. We're not using metrics of longevity or other factors that should be researched, that should be held up as societal values. And I'm wondering what's there in terms of vested interest. We know that with some of the research that was done in the 1800s, that there were vested interest in suppressing or misinterpreting the research for other agendas. I'm wondering what agendas might exist that prevent us from embracing forgiveness.
Okay, I want to say one thing here. I just think while you're talking, I was thinking, how do you do it? I mean, again, it's fairly simple if you don't obsess on what divides us. but you actually focus on what unites us. It's complicated if you really get stuck onto the things that divide you from someone else. I mean, we don't have to just talk about societal level, just individual level. You may have a quarrel with a friend, and if you get stuck on that, your friendship is gone. But then you have to just focus on the things that, first of all, made you and the other person friends, and then focus on all the good things that you have done together or spent time together, and try to, put those things on and see, what is most important. And then that's why you are able to overcome the differences and not focus on what divides, but focus more on what unites. Someone in the chat was bringing the issue of the Middle East. I think that a lot of it has to do with exactly the same thing that Marcus Aurelius was writing in his little memos to himself 2,000 years ago, cognitive reframing. Focus on what you actually have in common. You're all human beings. You can try to live together rather than try to kill each other all the time.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think, go ahead. Sorry.
You go ahead, Lauren.
I was just going to say, I think maybe the subtext to this question is how do we deal with the very sticky situation of forgiveness and yet still maintain some sense of, I've seen in the chat a couple different times, the question of accountability or justice popping up, especially regarding different, large scale global issues. And I think the really important thing to take away from that sort of concern is that some agendas are going to want to push forgiveness because they just don't want to have to deal with the consequences of wrongdoing from the past. And that could be nothing further from my mission. I mean, so what I would suggest is that forgiveness deals with kind of the emotional inner workings, the brain and the physiology of my own experience, the well-being of myself. All of the other issues about accountability and justice are social issues. And just because they're social issues doesn't mean that they don't still impact my brain and my body. But, when we talk about accountability and justice, that is really a separate, in fact, it's entirely separate from forgiveness. And you can see many examples. If you just kind of Google these things, you'll find many recent examples of amazing situations where people got zero justice and were able to forgive, and that's amazing. But you also find often that people get nearly perfect justice, it seems, or as close as we can get to it, and they're not able to forgive. And that's generally evidence that these are two very separate dimensions, two different experiences of our lives that when we have to confront these issues, we have to realize that forgiveness is largely about kind of taking care of, my experience and the feelings I might have towards someone or some group. And justice kind of happens in a sphere that is maybe connected with, but separate from largely the experience of forgiveness. I often don't have much control over the justice system, as frustrating as that is. But I do have control over my own forgiveness experience.
Yeah, I work with a lot of people who are in some relationship to the legal system. And so I think a lot about the very thing you're talking about, the relationship between forgiveness, justice. I like what you're saying. I too agree that they're two completely different things. However, I want to report, and this is anecdotal, but very strong anecdotal evidence over 20 years of practice, that when people who are engaged in conflict forgive, the results they get are much better in the other system. Sometimes almost what you would call miraculous, where the other person sort of comes around and offers something that was never foreseen. We can't manipulate that, and I don't think that's the reason to forgive, but it happens when we disengage and we, in a sense, true ourselves to all the things that you've been speaking to so eloquently, both of you. and do that for our own well-being, well, then you've achieved that no matter what, and that's enough of a reward. But I also think that you're much more effective and get better results in whether it's a mediation or a lawsuit or any kind of legal interaction. So I think that's encouraging too. You know, I wanted to, you're talking about changing the, Marco, you were just talking about how it's focus on what unites us, and it's straightforward to say that, but hard to do sometimes. But it goes back to this question, both of you have said this about changing habits, and how do we break habits? How do we do that when we know it's a good thing for us? And what I'm curious about is what role mirror neurons might play in this. For example, in a group setting, like a mediation or a family talk, but how could mirror neurons are at play, obviously, in those situations, but how can we, utilize that dynamic to help move things along?
Yeah, okay. So, and we go back one more time to the beginning of this conversation, because mirror neurons aren't just stuff that it's in your brain because they were planted in your brain. It's actually stuff that you can nurture and cultivate. At the end of the day, a mirror neuron is a cell that fires when I see you making an action, when I do the action myself. It allows a lot of other things. It triggers many processes and good processes in the brain. But it's something that if we go back to the notion of firing together and wiring together, humans are really good at, even very early in life, my friend Andy Meltzer shows that even a 41-minute-old baby can imitate very simple facial expressions. So if I'm the adult and I'm sticking my tongue out and the baby is able to do the same, his brain is now wiring the ability to do it, to stick the tongue out, and the ability to actually see someone else doing it. That's where a mirror neuron is born. You can do that more and more. You can actually train yourself to do it more and more. And if you do more and more of that, the more it's going to be easier for you to get into the minds of others, because you just get that from the bodily expression of other people. So one way of doing that is really try to get attuned to other people. The more you get attuned to others, when you have one-on-one or one or two or one or three conversations, the more you're really into also the bodily movements of other people, the more you're going to exercise your capacity to use your mirror neurons more and to deploy them in much more abstract situation. It's not that our thoughts come out of these very separate parts of the brain to the parts of the brain we use for our body, because even when it comes to, say, stopping myself to repeating continuously the same sentence, I have to use those care control regions that are also important for way more complex things. So all the brain is all interconnected, and you can actually train your brain to become more like a large mirroring device. And by doing that, you certainly help generating more and more communal thinking with other people, communal experiences and emotions. That, I would say, is the main thing that I would suggest to do to people. It's not that difficult, even when you're just having a normal conversation with friends, just to train yourself to be more attuned to what they're saying, but also to their bodily postures, to the way they are conveying their emotions or their experiences. Try to really be focused on others. And you're going to absorb so many experiences from other people. You're going to shape your brain to be more empathic, more receptive, and that's going to certainly help also forgiveness.
Are you saying, Marco, suggesting that to sort of consciously mirror to somebody their gestures or their body?
Yeah, well, up to a point. Otherwise, it's going to be like parroting. It's going to have really negative cascading effects during the social interaction. But really just being attuned, if you just focus on what other people are doing, you don't necessarily have to do it yourself. But your brain regions that are controlling your own body or your facial expressions or your verbal expression are also absorbing that thing internally. You don't have to mirror explicitly. But by doing that, the attunement to others is going to really shape your brain in a way that makes it more empathic and more receptive. And by doing that, you're going to certainly overcome the differences, and you're going to get way more empathic.
So you become more empathic. What impact does that have on them to receive that attunement?
That's the other hypothesis that I have. It's all a snowball effect in a positive way. The more you have an empathic agent in a community of agents, the more empathy is going to spread. Humans are really sponges. They're really able to imitate each other, not just bodily, but also in terms of attitudes, of feelings, even ideology. And so the more you actually nurture in yourself all these positive things, the more you're going to spread. You're going to be an agent of positive change in your community or society, because people are going to see that. Unless they really they want to just, have completely block that input that you're giving. But if you become a model, eventually that positive model is going to spread to people that are in your life and in your society, in your community.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming up for me in this conversation is that I look at here in the U.S. how our country was founded. It was founded with the very puritanical beliefs, and we see it today in our institutions. So we see it with our prison system. We haven't reconciled, can people be rehabilitated, or are they supposed to be there to be punished? And our legal system very much is supporting a conflicting narrative about what is the nature of humanity. We haven't reconciled our story about what's the true nature of humanity, that we are hardwired for collaboration and cooperation, the misappropriation of Charles Darwin. And so it feels like it's an uphill battle to change those narratives and to change the narrative of humanity. And yet the science that you've been doing for years, Marco, and the work that you've been doing, Lauren, are showing that we have institutions, we have systems in place that aren't a direct reflection of the true nature of humanity. I'm just wondering, as we're coming up on the close of the show, what are some things that we can be doing to change the narrative, to change our institutions?
Well, again, to me, you have to start by doing things yourself. Start talking to your friends, and to maybe be more active in your community, and to start spreading this notion that, again, let's focus on what unites us, not what divides us. And it's going to have a snowballing positive effect on everybody. Again, you're going to find people that are going to be blind and deaf to this message, but don't give up. Just keep doing it, and eventually other people that are more receptive will adopt your point of view and your attitude. And the more you spread this, the better the society is going to be. Don't just focus on the differences. If you focus on the difference, you're going to cling even more to people that belong to your social group, your political affiliation or attitudes. But then you're going to have always the people that are completely different from you. And if you do that, you're going to generate more and more division. And even though the division sometimes is may also feel good for you, because again, you have your group, you have your party, and the others are just the others. In the long term, it's not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for your offsprings, for people that down the line in your family, your grandchildren. You don't want to have this divisive society. It's just, it's so bad. It's really so bad.
And I guess I would just add to that, I think, reinforcing a couple of things that Marco just said. Usually in life, we inhabit kind of our own little comfort zone. And then where real change and progress happens is somewhere outside of that, in a very uncomfortable zone. And I think the the key thing we're talking about here in terms of what people can do is they can be uncomfortable about the fact that forgiveness is not perfect. It's not a solution for every problem, but there are lots of things that become simply issues of interpersonal conflict, of group conflict, of workplace conflict, perceptions of injustice and wrongdoing, and swelling experiences of hatred and disgust for other people. And those are opportunities to do the uncomfortable thing. That zone of discomfort is kind of where all the good stuff is, right? That's where the opportunity for growth exists. And it's really sort of natural, I think, and quite comfortable to complain and to, talk about how terrible this person is or how bad they treated you at work or whatever the case might be. It's very difficult, but very important to practice forgiveness whenever and wherever you get the opportunity. And it's one thing that we always say about forgiveness is that, it's one of those things that it happens by practice. And just like if you think of the most forgiving people, the most forgiving examples that maybe come to mind for some of you, it might be, your mother or your father or a close sibling or friend. Sometimes we attribute that to them being just forgiving people. Oh, they're such a forgiving person. I think if you asked them, they would say, I work really hard. I try to practice this virtue in my life on a daily basis, and it is not easy, but I just really value it. I think it's the right thing to do. And so I work really hard at it. And that goes for anyone that you see who's notable in our society, successful politicians, successful sports athletes, successful musicians. All too often we look at them and say, wow, what they were just really gifted. No, they weren't. They were somewhat gifted and they worked really hard. And forgiveness is kind of like that. It's something that requires a lot of practice and a lot of skill development to be able to recognize the opportunities where this is a place where I probably should just try to let this go. And because I've been thinking about it, I'm more prepared to do that. And that's the number one predictor of a successful forgiveness outcome is your want to, your desire to spend time and invest in it. That's the number one thing. There is no magic formula. There is no recipe to follow. There are different methods, and I mentioned a couple long ago, early in this conversation, that we've developed, and others have developed methods. And less important is the method, and more important is the want to.
That was lovely. And I am sorry, but I have to leave this lovely conversation because I have other duties and things to do. But it was a great way to finish this conversation from my standpoint.
Well, thank you both. Thank you both for being with us today and the work that you're doing in the world. And Eileen, I'll just invite you to share any closing thoughts and also tee up our audience for tomorrow's program.
Perfect. And thank you. First, I'll just say thank you to Marco, since you do have to leave, so you don't feel like you have to stay for this. So having you here, thank you so much. Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it and engaging, and I just love speaking to the moment of what can we do? Where's our power? What are our choices? And I really appreciate both of you giving us your expertise and your thoughts on that. And yeah, I don't want to end this conversation. It feels important. I feel inspired by it. So, Lauren, my only thing is I would love, and we'll talk more sometime, but to hear more about your book and your findings about all the health benefits and so forth. But as far as tomorrow, I'm excited to move into that as well. And as it seems like it's just going to naturally flow from this conversation, of course, tomorrow's topic is bridging the divides of our time. And how do we use forgiveness for that? We've already started that conversation in a meaningful way, but our guests will be addressing some other aspects of it. We'll have Marquita Campbell, who is a mediator and a forgiveness coach. And she's going to be talking about the importance of dignity, both dignity violations and healing dignity wounds, which is really something that I don't think we often look through that lens. And it's a really important one because dignity wounds and violations lie at the heart of a lot of the trauma and the conflicts that we've been talking about. And then our second speaker tomorrow is Ken Cloak, who is a brilliant, brilliant mediator from Southern California, an attorney and mediator. He's an author of many books, but more importantly, just such a wise being. And I've been reading Ken's books and listening to him speak for over 20 years, and I'm learning something from him. So I really hope you'll be able to join us for that tomorrow. And Tom, thank you, and thanks to the team for putting this all together and for everybody who's here with us. It's really exciting.
Well, thank you, Lauren, for being with us today. Eileen, it's been a terrific week so far. Looking forward to being back with you again tomorrow to bring our audience another great conversation on forgiveness. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and see you again tomorrow. Bye.
Bye.
And we'll see you in the after chat if you'd like to come. The address is in the chat.
Thanks, Stan.